From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know. I'd like to talk briefly about something that I personally take as good news when we're talking about evolving policy. One of the things that we've mentioned in the past on this show is that a clear and deleterious effect of prohibitive drug policies is that they can stymie research into possible benefits of a substance, or even just learning more about something. And that applies to marijuana for a long time, but it also applies to psilocybin, to these psychoactive or hallucinogenic substances. And in the past few weeks, or in the past few years, but I was just reading the news a few weeks ago, up to a few days ago. It seems that there has been a lot of progress in the research front on the possible benefits of psychoactive substances. And this is pretty solid methodology. It appears to me. I'm not the expert. I wasn't involved in the studies.
Right.
I understand what they're talking about.
You study them in other ways, shall we say?
Yes, perhaps. Yes, that's the most diplomatic way. Thank you. But I wanted to ask you specifically about this, because I know there's a lot of people struggle to find optimism in the situation that we have been in as a nation for so long. There are a lot of dangerous and terrible things that have happened as a result of prohibitive policies. So what do we see as the future of psychedelics? I'm asking specifically because I just read that someone in New York has filed a bill to legalize medical psilocybin. Do you think these kinds of things will pass? Will psilocybin become will it assume the role that marijuana currently has in the future?
Well, not quite marijuana, Ben, but it's a great question. I mean, there is truly a psychedelic renaissance going on right now. And most of these substances, psilocybin, also mescaline. I mean, psilocybin's the key ingredient in mushrooms. Mescaline's the key ingredient in peyote and the San Pedro plant. Then there's LSD. Then there's MDMA, ecstasy, which is not really a psychedelic, but sometimes people group it in that category. And then there's 5-MeO-DMT, which is what they call the toad medicine. It's another powerful thing. So those are just some of the examples. So there's an incredible, really a psychedelic renaissance going on right now. And I'm just blown away by it. I was just at a couple of conferences on psychedelics in business and then psychedelics and the movements, both in Miami and New York in the recent months. And even though these drugs are on what's called Schedule 1 in most cases, not ketamine. Ketamine's the one legal sort of psychedelic that we have ketamine clinics popping up and it's legally regulated. And so that's the one short-acting quasi-psychedelic that's out there. But, Schedule 1, what that means is that the government has said that there's no legitimate medical uses and great harm associated with this drug. And, ridiculously, marijuana remains in Schedule 1. So it points out what a farce the entire scheduling system is and how highly politicized it is. I mean, that, and I think in a way that farce helped us in our marijuana legalization efforts because, here we're winning these ballot initiatives on medical marijuana back in the 90s and 2000s, and the government's saying there's no such thing as medical marijuana. And, over a third of Americans know people personally are using marijuana medically. So the fact that the government was lying helped to delegitimize their case and helped us, I think, ultimately move forward with legalizing marijuana and winning support. Now, with the psychedelics, it is technically possible to do research on Schedule 1 drugs. I mean, there's even been research giving heroin to human subjects going on in the past at Columbia and Johns Hopkins and at Wayne State in Michigan. So it's possible. And what you've now seen happening is more and more private companies, or in a key case, an organization called MAPS, multidisciplinary associated psychedelic studies, that have been moving forward with the FDA, getting permission to do these research studies. Right. And so we're now seeing that MDMA is probably going to be approved by the FDA for treatment of PTSD at roughly 2 years from now. And we're also seeing that psilocybin, the ingredient in mushrooms, is probably going to be approved by the FDA for treatment of intractable depression, maybe a year or two after that. Right. So that's going to cause them to be rescheduled. So we are seeing some evolution. And meanwhile, there are dozens of studies, mostly funded now more with private investment capital than with foundation support, that are moving forward, especially in the US and Canada, a few in Europe, right? And finally, just a few months ago, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, for the first time in like 40 or 50 years, just approved a grant to Johns Hopkins for a study giving psilocybin and seeing if it helps people stop smoking. So I think we're going to see more federal funding in this area as well. So on the one hand, there's this kind of medicalization approach that's going through the FDA or its European equivalents that is really showing this incredible promise. And there are, you look at some of these companies out, the company doing the psilocybin research, Compass, has a stock market valuation of like $1.5 billion. And one of the major investment funds, also $1.5 billion. And another company that's setting up retreats and clinics, is valued at $500 million. So this is a rapidly growing area, both of small startup firms and of companies going public. And I think this is going to continue. I mean, there'll be mistakes made and there'll be some pushback, but the media coverage is fantastic. Then there's that second track that you mentioned, the decriminalization track. Right, that's what was started when Denver decriminalized, psilocybin possession. I think it was a few years ago, and then the city of Oakland did the same thing, and more recently Detroit did it in the most recent election, and then Oregon, remarkably, last year passed 2 major ballot initiatives. One was one that my organization, Drug Policy Alliance, under the leadership of my successors, were introduced. And that was to decriminalize possession of all drugs, including heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine, where people essentially would not go to jail for possession of small amounts. But the other one was a psychedelics initiative that basically said possession is decriminalized and that the state of Oregon should move forward with allowing people to be prescribed psilocybin or psilocybin, not just for serious illness, but even for general mental health and well-being. And so what we're going to see now is more of that psychedelics reform moving forward through ballot initiatives in other states. It might be Washington, California, Colorado, you name it. Typically the Western states go first. Or it might be legislation like the one in New York that you mentioned, where it's beginning to move forward. So these 2 tracks, the decriminalization and the legitimization of regulated, access to these drugs in a quasi-medical environment and clinics, and on the other hand, the very medical environment. I mean, there's amazing momentum behind these things. I cannot claim much credit because, although personally psychedelics have played a very important role in my own life, in my organization, we were only involved at the edges of this. And far more credit goes to, Rick Doblin, who founded the Multidisciplinary Associated Psychedelic Studies, MAPS, back in the 80s, and who's led this effort, and to other researchers, at major universities, and now to some of the investors who are obviously trying to make money, but taking some real risk to get this stuff moving forward. And of course, the philanthropists.
Mm-hmm. Like Soros. No, I'm just
actually, Soros, it's funny when I talked to George about the psychedelic stuff a long time ago. Hey, Matt, I got to tell you, just a funny story here. So back, it must have been 2015, I think it was, and I organized a fundraising dinner at Soros's apartment, right? And I had there, some of our biggest donors. One of them was Sean Parker, from Facebook fame and all that. And another one was a guy named John Morgan, a very controversial guy in Florida who's been a big Democratic Party contributor. And then one of Soros's sons was there, and some other major people from investment banks and things like that. And there was this lull in the conversation. And so just for the hell of it, I don't know what got into me. I said to them, "You'll never guess where I was last week." And they said, "Where?" I said, "The World Ayahuasca Congress in Ibiza." And they said, the World What Congress? The IAHU? The IA what? Right? And, they had no idea what I was talking about. And then at that point, George's son jumps in and he goes, Dad, or actually calls him George, you have no idea how many ayahuasca sessions are happening in Brooklyn and in Manhattan every weekend, right? So George, he and the key staff were never much into this, but fortunately, one of the key people working within the foundation, a good friend of mine, Kasia Melanovska, she's been sympathetic to this. So we've begun to see a limited amount of funding coming out of Soros's foundation, very, very small, for psychos reform. I'm not even sure George knows about it, but it's definitely helping. And from their angle, it's putting the money in on the social justice side, right? So it's about the role of indigenous people and making sure they're protected. It's about trying to introduce some racial justice elements in the psychedelics world. So that's really the focus of his foundation on this stuff. But it's tiny compared to everything else.
I wonder how many of those stories you have. Just weird connections and then drugs jump in somewhere.
Matt, I got to tell you, it's true. I mean, also, from the left wing to the right wing and foreign presidents and dignitaries and media, it's funny. It's true. These stories keep pouring out. And, one day I'll write a book about it, I guess, is the common expression that one gives about this. Although I'll tell you, one of the joys about doing this podcast, Psychoactive, is that in each of the episodes, I get to tell some of these stories. Because I'm having guests on and, I'll have somebody who wrote a Pulitzer Prize winning book about the drug war within the black community. And I can share my experiences with Jesse Jackson and Charlie Rangel and others. Or Ben mentioned having the former Colombian president who won the Nobel Peace Prize, Juan Manuel Santos. But I've known him for a decade and can tell some of those stories. And so that's one of the joys for me of doing the podcast.
And this is one of the reasons that it was so important for us to have you on the show today. And first, as we said at the very beginning, thank you so much for joining us, because we want our fellow listeners to learn more about these incredibly important issues, to learn the context, to learn the present, and to learn the future, and to hopefully, and I will make this a call to action, hopefully to join in creating that future, because as you point out, this is such a complex situation. There are a lot of factors involved, and I think everybody can agree that as a society, the U.S. could do a lot better. It's the way corporate America would probably phrase it is, there are areas of opportunity. And
well, Ben, I'll tell you something. I mean, given especially the name of your podcast here, Stuff They Don't Want You to Know, my one sort of parting piece of advice for your listeners is, whenever you see a new drug scare, look again. Because the odds are it's wrong. Now, in the case of fentanyl and the overdoses, it's right. Fentanyl is deadly, and you got to be careful and not be mucking around, and it's even showing up in cocaine and other drugs like that. So there's some truth to it there, right? And so you do need to be aware. And it's a shame the government's been lying and deceiving so much that people sometimes fail to appreciate that. On the other hand, when you see the stuff now being said about opioids, and when you see the stuff being said about vaping of nicotine, that stuff oftentimes is grossly exaggerated and oftentimes factually inaccurate. And the fact that the mainstream media, including the New York Times and others, are buying into this stuff, the fact that some of the worst offenders sometimes are not right-wing nutheads, but left-wing progressive politicians who have generally been good about ending the war on drugs, but they jump on the bandwagon when it comes to new things around opioids or vaping. So I would just, parting words was, look carefully. If you're curious, look at the evidence and don't buy the initial bullshit, because the willingness of even smart people or people who think they're smart and educated and have wisdom and are progressive to buy into mainstream bullshit is unlimited. But because we see ourselves as enlightened and progressive oftentimes, we think we're immune to that. But oftentimes we're not.
Very well said. Yeah. And we do have to do a little bit of disclosure, I think, Matt. We are both big fans of Psychoactive. I'm tremendously impressed. I have learned so much just from tuning in. And Matt, you are also instrumental in the show. This is a Matt Frederick production.
What? I've never heard of this show before. I just met Ethan today. No.
I gotta say, Matt, I was so psyched when you came to the launch party for Psychoactive in New York in the summer, and the look in your eyes and your enthusiasm when you were meeting some of these characters. I loved it. I loved it.
No, it's true. Yeah, we were on a rooftop in New York City, and they were characters in your life, but they're also highly influential people, mostly in the field of education. The people that I was speaking with, they were like professors who've been working for ages just studying some of these topics, and people who've been working their entire lives, to advocate for some of the same things you're advocating for, Ethan. It was very moving to be there. And yes, I am an executive producer on the show, but I would just say, everybody, if you get a chance, please listen. Some of the most interesting, informative conversations around the topic of drugs exist in that show. And I'm very uncomfortable with drugs personally, and I don't use many, if at all. I have a vape, and I drink some alcohol every once in a while, but it's really changed the way I view the topic entirely. So thank you for making the show, Ethan, and please check it out, everybody, if you get a chance.
And I should just call you. Many people have asked me, do I get high when I record the show? And the truth is, I don't smoke marijuana, because I find that if I use marijuana, it's hard to stay focused and remember what the previous question I asked was. So I never get high before. But I just recorded an episode about this drug kratom, which is sold legally in most states in America. And in this case, I went out yesterday, I bought some kratom, and I drank a glass of kratom while I was interviewing my guest about the subject. So that was a bit of a new experience.
So that's the new thing? You just do whatever drug you're going to talk about that episode?
It's got to be a mild one, because I'm not going to, I was thinking I probably should start microdosing before I do an episode on microdosing, but I keep forgetting to microdose. So,
There is one. So another thing I enjoy, I fully agree with Matt's point about the tremendously important educational nature, but I also, I have to 100% confirm what you said earlier about these stories just come out of me. That's something I really enjoy in Psychoactive. And there was a Rolling Stone interview, I think it was Rolling Stone, that you did, where you said when the laws had changed in New York, you and a friend decided, oh, okay, we're going to smoke a joint on the street. And there's a cop across the street.
Oh, Ben, exactly. I'm walking with a friend. It's like the day or two after the New York law had passed. It's the first law in the country which allows people to smoke a joint in public. So we're in Central Park, and we can't smoke in Central Park because you're not allowed to smoke tobacco in Central Park. So I said, let's go outside. So we walk outside. It's on 5th Avenue around 100th Street, right? And so there we're on a sidewalk. It's legal. And I'm across the street from Mount Sinai Hospital, which is actually where I was born. And there's a police car across the street. And I start to, and my friend goes, Ethan, what are you doing? I said, this is a cop car. I said, Howard, this is the meeting of freedom. And in fact, even if we were not two old white guys, but two young black men, we could still do it. So I feel very proud of that moment. It really brought home to me the kind of personal element of the freedom that we're fighting for and trying to end the war on drugs.
Well, there you have it, everyone. Check out Psychoactive. This has been Ethan Nadelmann.
I'm sorry. I feel, my only regret here is that we do eventually have to end this episode. Yeah. But that's not the end of the story. The story does continue in Psychoactive. I would also like to highlight for anybody interested in how is it phrased? The internationalization of criminal law enforcement. Do check out the books that you have. You've created, Cops Across Borders, Policing the Globe. The information that will empower people in this ongoing conversation. It's out there. It's available. And to your point, yes, there are entities that consider that information the stuff they don't want you to know, which means that wherever you fall personally, you should know it.
Exactly. Well, guys, thanks so much for the opportunity to be on this with you. I love doing it. Matt, I appreciate your work on Psychoactive, and I appreciate this podcast. So, Ben, great to meet you as well. Sorry I didn't get to meet your colleague, but hopefully there'll be another time.
Also, I just want to confirm, because I forget about this sometimes, but if you can see on our chat here, that's a life-size plastic skeleton. It's like a mascot of the show. I just wanted to openly acknowledge that, because I forget that can be weird sometimes.
I was kind of wondering about that, Ben, but now I'm glad you told me.
We're about transparency. So
yes,
it's all good. I've got ink blot tests behind me, so we're fine.
And all I have is what the ties in my closet or something like this.
We cannot wait for the next episodes. I want to thank you for your time. And at this point, folks, we also want to pass the mic to you. What do you think is the future of drug policy, not just in the U.S., but in the world? What do you think of what we call the long tail consequences of some of these prohibitive policies? Let us know. We try to be easy to find online. If you don't sip the social medias, you can give us a call at our phone number, 1-833-STD-WYTK. And if you want to send us an email, we read every single one we get. We can't wait to hear from you. All you have to do is drop us a line. We are
conspiracy@iheartradio.com. Listen to Psychoactive.